is an honor to be here, and it's also quite intimidating for some reason. I should know better than be intimidated, but I am. This talk will be about psychology, because psychology is what I know, but I would like to begin to set the stage by talking about the word to know. What does it mean? What does this word mean? Now, in everyday language, there are two conditions for using the word know: the absence of doubt and the truth of the belief. We only say that someone knows something if that thing is true, if the fact is true. Now, science is knowledge, and scientists have very strong views about what it means to know. You can't be said to know something unless you have objective evidence that would convince another scientist. This is what we think knowledge consists of. So we think we know what it means to know. But in fact, the definition is contested. And this, I think, in the context of communication of science to the public, is really very important. Other communities have very different views about what it means to know and to believe. So, for example, for scientists, believing, unlike knowing, does not carry a guarantee of truth. But this is certainly not true for true believers. True believers believe that what they believe is true. They know it. They have a different conception of what knowing is. And for them, the guarantee of truth is revelation and faithful transmission. And that is sufficient. It's just a different way of knowing. And from their point of view, not ours, but from their point of view, science is just another religion with its own rituals and its own claims, and like all other religions, it's false, or it could be false, or there's certainly no guarantee that it is true. So we have to recognize that the definition of knowledge is contested, and we have to take that into account, I think, in trying to communicate science to people who do not accept our definition or our concept. I want to make it clear, I'm a true believer. It's just that we're not going to be very successful unless we recognize that there is that gap and that other people have very different views about what knowledge is. And now let me turn to stuff I know more, and to the psychology of knowing. I will introduce two fictitious agents that populate the mind. Now, this is really, a psychologist is not supposed to do that, to invoke homunculi or little people inside the head whose behavior explain the agent's behavior. I'm going to do just that. I'm going to talk of two, and I'll call them systems, although they're not systems, and I'll label them System 1 and System 2. And they correspond, to give you a quick introduction to what they are, they correspond to two very different ways in which ideas come to mind. And so you can think of what happens in your mind when you hear 2 plus 2, and something came to your mind. And now think and compare that to what happens in your mind when somebody says 17 times 24. And notice that what happened the first time was completely automatic. You did not decide to do it, you did not intend to do it, it just happened. When you heard 17 times 24, probably nothing very definite came to mind, but you recognized it as a multiplication problem. You probably knew whether you could do it in your head or not, and you had a choice to make whether or not to do it. You probably wisely decided not to try. But the point is, if you had decided, if you do carry out that multiplication, it is a deliberate act. It is not automatic, it is intentional, it is effortful, it involves mental work. And in fact, quite hard mental work. And that first study of what the pupil does, the pupil is actually a superb indicator of the amount of mental work that is exerted. The pupil dilates when you load memory, or the pupil dilates when you exert mental effort of any kind. Now, some other examples of activities that I will attribute to System 1. So, when I remind you of your mother, that evokes an emotion, and that emotion, that happens to you. You're not, it just occurs. It's automatic. It's System 1 produces, in my terms, produces that emotion. The terms, by the way, are not mine. They're common in psychology, but I do have to apologize for them. When you swerve, you drive, well, driving is mostly System 1 when you are a skilled driver. It is not System 1 when you have to make a left turn into traffic. That becomes deliberate. And one mark of mental effort is that you cannot exert mental effort on more than a few things at once. Actually, if one of them is involving, you can't do anything else. So when you're making a left turn into traffic, you cannot actually compute 17 times 24, and you shouldn't try, because, So, examples of System 2 activities, well, reading a map is a System 2 activity. Filling an income tax form is a System 2 activity. Deliberate memory search is a System 2 activity, as against the memories that come to mind, automatically and effortlessly. You can decide to search for, the capital of a country starting with an N, and that is effort, and your pupil will dilate, your heart will accelerate, and you will be momentarily distracted from the ability to do other things. So this talk is really about how a two-system mind knows, or thinks it knows, or believes that it knows. As I've described it, System 1 can be identified with associative memory. And it produces the kind of thoughts that we call intuitive thoughts. It produces the kind of actions like swerving when you encounter an obstacle while driving that we call instinctive, complete misnomer, but that's a common term, and it produces feelings and emotions. Now, the notion of what an association is, we're all familiar with it, but the notion within psychology has changed a great deal over the last few decades. And so we're all aware of simple associations, such as black goes to white and salt calls for pepper. And that's the classic notion of association that the British empiricists dealt with in the 17th and 18th century. But what actually happens in the mind, in associative memory, is considerably richer than that. That is, when an event occurs, it doesn't activate a single association, it activates an entire network of associations. And we're not conscious of this activation, but what the activation does, it prepares us to interpret what comes next in a particular way. It also produces what really amounts to an interpretation of the current situation. And in some ways, it biases the way that we perceive reality. Let me give you one simple example. If I say she approached the bank, many of you have had an image, and many of you thought that bank refers to a financial institution. In the context of fishing, she approached the bank means something else. Now, what is important is that so the sentence by itself, she approached the bank, is completely ambiguous. It is interpretable, fully interpretable, only in context. We're not aware of the ambiguity. We choose bank, mostly as a financial institution, we choose that interpretation because probably for most of us, we encounter that kind of banks more often than the other kind of banks. This happens automatically, the selection by frequency, and it actually is very adaptive, and associations are very adaptive in that way. Now here is another example. Actually, this is a personal story, but it's, I think, one of the best examples of associative bias that I know about. My wife and I had dinner with a couple, and we were exchanging views about what had happened, and my wife spoke. She said of the man in the couple, she said, he is sexy. And, all right. And then she said something truly bizarre. She said, he doesn't undress the maid himself. He doesn't undress the maid himself. Now, I was very puzzled. It's not, and I asked her, what on earth are you saying? And it turns out that what she had actually said was, he doesn't underestimate himself. Now, so all of this happened in my mind. I was prepared. A single word, he is sexy, had set me up had biased me to expect. But it's not really an active expectation. It is that there is a bias to interpret new stimuli so that they are coherent and they fit with what just happened. And this is the way associative memory works. Now, I did not, what happened to me is interesting, I think, in several ways. One is, it didn't occur to me that she couldn't possibly have said this, so she must have said something else. That was not my thought. I knew what she had said, and she had said something that was very bizarre. So there is that feeling of knowing, which in this case was completely illusory. That feeling of knowing comes with just a sensation. You assume that this is it. And then it's surprising, you try to fit it in, you ask questions. But the fact that it was surprising didn't make me reinterpret it. The interpretation was already set. Now, this associative system works it anticipates the future, it prepares you for the future, but it also interprets the present in light of the past. And it searches, as it were. I mean, there's no active search, but in fact it finds, the new event finds possible antecedents. So I'll give you a sentence that was used in an experiment on that. After spending a day exploring beautiful sights in the crowded streets of New York, Jane discovered that her wallet was missing. Now, that sentence was heard by people along with many other sentences, and then people were probed, and were asked to recall the sentences. And the word pickpocket appeared more frequently in people's recall than the word sights, although the word pickpocket was never mentioned, and the word sights was in the actual sentence. What happened is you have that event, and it generates a possible cause as an association. And now you have a story that makes sense. And this is really what System 1, what associative memory produces. It produces stories that make sense. Now, sometimes you can see how ridiculous this process yields fairly ridiculous results. Nassim Taleb, in his book The Black Swan, reports that on the day that Saddam Hussein was caught, the price of treasury bonds fluctuated. And at first, the price of treasuries rose. And Bloomberg announced that and had a headline: US treasuries rise, Hussein capture may not curb terrorism. Half an hour later, the price of the bond prices fell, and there was a revised headline, and it read, treasuries fall, Hussein capture boosts allure of risky assets. Now what happens, and it's an important mechanism, there had been an event. This, by the way, is what financial pundits make a living from. There had been an important event that morning. Anything that was going to happen in the market would search for an explanation and would find that important event and would construct a story. And both stories sort of make sense, and that is the way the system works. Now, good stories appear probable, appear much more plausible than stories that are less good. So I'll give you an example of a study that actually Amos Tversky carried out. He did that in a congress of professional forecasters. And he distributed questionnaires, which were different, so there were two versions. And in one version, people were asked to assign a probability to the following event. What is the probability that within the next 10 years, there will be a flood somewhere in the US in which more than 1,000 people will die? People assigned a probability to that. Other people were asked, what is the probability that sometime during the next 10 years, there will be an earthquake in California causing a flood in which more than 1,000 people will die? And you can guess which probability was higher. The second event was judged significantly more likely than the first. Now, of course, this is absurd. If there is an earthquake in California, then in particular, there is a flood in which 1,000 people will die. One event includes the other, but one event is a much better story than the other, and the events that makes the better story is the one that people judge more probable. So our confidence is, and I'll come back to that theme because it's extremely important, our confidence is associated very closely with the coherence of the stories that are automatically generated in associative memory. Now, here is another way that associative memory works. Is the following argument valid? And here is the argument. All roses are flowers. Some flowers fade quickly. Therefore, some roses fade quickly. And students in multiple experiments were asked, is the argument valid? Now let me repeat the argument. All roses are flowers. Some flowers fade quickly. Therefore, some roses fade quickly. The argument is not valid. It's entirely possible that some flowers fade quickly, but none of them are roses. Now, a vast majority of undergraduates consider this valid. And what happens is the conclusion is true. And they evidently, truth and validity are highly associated, and instead of really assessing the validity of the argument, they're so strongly biased by the truth of the conclusion that they consider the argument valid. Now, if you create the same syllogism where the conclusion is false, no mistakes are made. It's trivially obvious. Furthermore, and this is important, if you present the syllogism in formal terms, with A's and B's, people are reminded of Venn diagrams, and mostly they get it right. But when they are biased by truth, they misjudge validity. Now this is telling us, I think, something that is relevant to the communication of science. People reason backward as well as forward. They think backward as well as forward. And when we believe in a conclusion, we believe arguments that support that conclusion. It is not that the arguments come first. The conclusion comes first. And if the conclusion is there and we believe in it, we are going to be strongly biased to believe the arguments as well. Now, this sounds like an inference, but it's not an inference. It is actually a qualitatively different process. Inferences have reasons. Inferences have arguments. But associations have causes. It is really not an inference. It just happens that you are prompted to do that and something comes to mind. And that is associative. It is not a reasoning process. Now, there is a key difference between associations and inferences. Order and sequence are essential to inferences. So we go from premises to conclusion. The Turing tape moves, sometimes backward, sometimes forward, but it moves. Associations are largely symmetric. This is not always the case. Salt, pepper goes better than pepper to salt, but many associations are symmetric. So let me give you examples. and those examples turn out to be, among many others. If a disgusting word is mentioned, say the word vomit, now, you felt, everybody did, some discomfort, bit of disgust, and you make a disgust face. Now, if you shape people to make a disgust face, they will feel disgusted. So it really works both ways. We know that from other experiments. In particular, the one I like best is an experiment that is done with a pencil. And you ask people to take a pencil and put it in their mouth like this. And then you show them cartoons. And the cartoons are actually funnier than usual when people hold a pencil in their mouth like this. And they are funnier than usual because, unbeknownst to the individual, this shapes their face in the shape of a smile. Whereas if you hold the pencil like this, cartoons are not funny at all. So this is just one example out of many of the symmetry in associations, and it's the same symmetry that we also find between arguments and conclusions. Things work both ways in many cases. So, what I'm leading to in that distinction is that there are really two kinds of coherence. And coherence is, a feature of a collection of ideas. We can say that a set of ideas is more or less coherent. We normally, scientists, think of coherence as logical coherence. It's associated with serial operations of reasoning. If you believe that if A, then B, and if you believe that A, then you must believe that B. This is the way that logical coherence works. There is another kind of coherence, which is associative and emotional coherence, and it is very different. It is not sequential, it is actually the model for it, in the coherence of a network. It's a network of ideas, and they fit. Ideas that support each other are reinforced, other ideas are inhibited, and they fall by, and what you have is a solution that is a coherent solution. And system one, the associative system, follows the latter kind of coherence. It produces, its products are associatively coherent and emotionally coherent. I'll give you a few examples. It's a well-known psychologist, did several examples of this general kind, but you take undergraduates and they have a glass of orange juice and they're given a sticker, and they're asked to write the word cyanide on the sticker and then to put the sticker on the orange juice and to drink the orange juice. They don't like it. You take undergraduate, Paul Rosen has a vivid imagination, you take undergraduates and you give them a comb in its plastic wrapping, new, untouched, and you ask them to take it out and to stir milk with it and then to drink the milk. They don't want to do it. Now, what is happening here is associative and emotional. Those two ideas don't fit. We feel the discomfort and we respond to the discomfort. I mean, they know in some sense that the orange juice is fine and that the comb is perfectly clean, but something in their associative system has triggered an emotion, which is a negative emotion. They don't want to do it. Now, this has a great deal to do with how people believe and how they think they know. Because the basis of belief for many people, for most people, is we believe people. We believe people that we like and trust, and we believe what they say. And for most of us, most of our beliefs really come that way. And if we don't like people and they say something, we do not feel that same degree of belief. It is not associatively and emotionally compatible. And that turns out to be extremely strong, this effect of trust and emotional trust and attachment on what people believe. Now, there is Dan Kahneman spoke this afternoon, I believe. I wasn't here, actually. But there is a cultural theory of attitudes to risk and to the environment that he has proposed. And what he notices is that very powerful correlation between, in American society, between attitudes to gay marriage and beliefs about global warming. I mean, the same people who don't like gay marriage, the idea of gay marriage, do not believe in global warming. Why? And it turns out that if you want to explain why, one way is you can invoke culture, and another way is just to say that the people that, it turns out opinion leaders, church leaders, people that most of us believe have attitudes that couple those two. It could be for completely arbitrary reasons. But if we believe those people, we will tend to adopt and trust their beliefs. And that will generate a pattern that is very, very difficult to break and is, in some sense, impossible to explain rationally. There seems to be no connection between the two. But there is an associative and emotional connection between the two. So there are cultural explanations, but at the micro level, at the level of psychology, associative and emotional consistency, I think, can explain it. Now, I've spoken of System 1 so far. I'll turn briefly to System 2. System 2 is related, that's a system that produces deliberate actions, and it's related to control, and it's related to attention, and rule-governed behavior. To follow rules, which is a sequential process, that is a System 2 activity which demands effort. Now, System 2 is also involved in the control of behavior and in the control of thoughts. So we do not say everything that comes to mind. We don't. But so there is some monitoring of System 1 by System 2. But the monitoring is far from perfect. So let me give you an example. It's a puzzle. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, everyone has an association. And the association is 10 cents. And it's false. It is not the correct answer to that problem. The correct answer is 5 cents. Now, what is interesting about this problem, well, it's a conjunction fact. About 50% of students at MIT fail. They write 10 cents. And that's true at Princeton and Harvard. And there are some universities where the proportion of people who say 10 cents reaches 85 to 90%. Now, what we know about anyone who said 10 cents is that person did not check the answer. Because if you check the answer, it's immediately apparent that 10 cents is not the answer. So anyone who writes this didn't check. This is very typical. And I would like to use this as a sort of model for the relationship between System 1 and System 2. System 1 comes up with associations which act as suggestions. And mostly, these are endorsed by System 2. So System 2 is capable of inhibiting. By the way, if their lives depended on it, they would check, and they certainly would find the correct answer. But their lives don't depend on it. And most of the time, if we are trying to characterize System 2, the characterization of System 2 as lazy is a pretty good one. For many of us, there are individual differences. Some systems do much lazier than others, but there are interesting correlations. The people who do not check themselves on the bat and ball problem are more reluctant to delay gratification than the people who do check themselves and produce the correct answer. So there is a link between self-control, the allocation of attention, and the activity of system 2. Now, the example I gave earlier with validity and truth is another example in which, system 2 could check, but it doesn't. There is, the conclusion is true, and the inference is made that the argument is true. So what we get, and that's the main point of this lecture, really. I'm trying to describe the relationship between these two systems so that system 2 is in one sense in control, because it can reject some things, inhibit some things, it can check, but mostly, much of the time, it acts, as a spokesperson for system 1. So system 1 makes suggestions and system 2 explains them or rationalizes them. So in my story so far, the mistakes that people make arise from system 1, but so do the marvels of intuitive thinking and expertise. Because system 1, the automatic system, includes all the highest skills that we have. So, if a chess master can see strong moves immediately at a single glance, this is the result of a great deal of expertise, and expert intuition is system 1. It has all the characteristics of system 1. The idea occurs to you. Reading is expertise, and we can't help reading. Reading, when there is a single word, you're going to read it. You can't really decide not to. Driving, as I said, is system 1. We are very impressed by expert intuition when it comes to physicians or to firefighters or to people who seem to know what they're doing. But actually, most of us know what we're doing most of the time. That is, we're really all experts in our world. And we trust system 1, mostly, and we have very good reason to trust system 1, mostly. It is so much quicker and so much more efficient than system 2 that we could not imagine a system, we could not imagine circumstances under which people would actually control themselves all the time and monitor themselves all the time. We have to trust system 1. But if it is really important to get it right under some conditions, we must slow down. Now, scientists in their professional role are system 2. They work on system 2. That is what it is. You develop the argument, you check it, you make sure, you imagine what hostile referees will say, and you check yourself again. But the mention of hostile referees is actually important because it is routine in science for people to say, I would like not to be reviewed by this person. And we consider that legitimate because it is not an accusation that that person is corrupt. It is a recognition that that person is likely to be biased and is likely to look for flaws in the work that I'm submitting. And this is considered legitimate, and it's a recognition that even within science, system 1 plays a certain role. Now, on the marvels of system 1, I want to stress the astonishing efficiency with which it represents the knowledge that we have of the world. And here my favorite example is an experiment in which people listen to voices saying sentences, and there is one particular sentence is spoken, I won't try to mimic that, by an upper-class British male voice. And it says, I have large tattoos all down my back. And brain recordings are taken, and within about 1/3 of a second, there is a distinctive signature of surprise in the reaction of the brain to that sentence. Now, if you think about it, I find it astonishing. You have to recognize the voice as an upper-class British male voice. You have to evoke the stereotype of upper-class British males. You have to recognize that upper-class British males are unlikely to have large tattoos all down their back. So there is an incongruity. That's a surprise. That mobilizes system too. It's like hearing my wife say something bizarre. This is what happens. Now, our knowledge of the world is built into our associative system, and it functions marvelously most of the time, but not always. System one, the associative system, is also wonderful at the speed with which it updates its knowledge. When there is no violation of existing preconceptions, when there is no belief system that is violated, and actually the story I'm going to tell involves somebody that you've all seen, John Krosnick. My wife Anne Treisman and I were vacationing in Australia off on the reef, and there is a lovely island with a small resort, 40 rooms, and we were there, and we go to dinner, and we meet John Krosnick, and a colleague from Stanford. A big coincidence. We remark on this, and we're really quite impressed. And then 2 weeks later, we're in a London theater, and the lights are dimmed, and somebody comes and sits next to me, and the lights come up, and it's John Krosnick. and what I don't know how John reacted to it, so I've never asked him, but I think I can speak for two of us, for my wife and I. I was much less surprised the second time than the first. And the reason is that you get that event, the second, evoked the first, and a generalization was ready. Oh, John Krosnick, he's the guy I meet everywhere. So that happens automatically. This is the way we update our knowledge of the world. When what we learn doesn't conflict with existing beliefs. When what we learn does conflict with existing beliefs, we don't accept it. We reject it, we don't believe it. So the same system that makes us extremely flexible and extremely ready to learn also makes us extremely rigid when the expectations are very strong. So, I will mention something else that System 1 does, just to give you a sense of where it violates logic and where it So here is a story. I'm going to tell you that Julie is a graduating senior at a university, and I'm going to tell you one fact about Julie. She read fluently when she was 4 years old. And now I ask, what is her GPA? And the odd thing is that just about everyone will admit that they have a number, that a GPA came to mind, and we actually know the process by which that GPA came to mind. What you have is the notion of reading at age 4, so she's precocious, but we have an idea of how precocious she is. And in fact, in that case, it corresponds vaguely to a percentile on reading age. Now, what we do is we also have a percentile distribution for GPA, and we match the percentiles. And the GPA that came to mind is actually as intense, if you will, as the evidence about precocity. Now, this is really a very robust phenomenon, and it's completely wrong. It's absurd to take such an uninformative detail as the age at which she read and use that detail to predict an event 20 years later or 18 years later when so many other things could have happened. In fact, you should stay very close with only that information. You will guess that she's above average. That is, a statistical analysis will lead you to guess that she's above average, probably in her GPA, but not by much. That's what we call regressive prediction. I'll give you another example of how this works. About 20 years ago, that experiment was run. That was a period when there was a lot of terrorism in Europe. And people were selling travel insurance at the airport. And in the experiment, they obtained prices that people were willing to pay for two different policies. And one of the policies is said that you are paid $100,000 in case of death for any reason during your trip. And the other one was you're paid $100,000 in case of death in a terrorist incident during your trip. Now, the second policy is worth more than the first. And think about it. If you die of terrorism, then, obviously the first one is worth more than the second. But what happens? Very much the same as truth and validity. People actually answer that question by consulting something that is readily available and accessible to them, which is how afraid they are. And people are more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than they're afraid of dying. And that actually is, we can understand that as part of an associative process. In general, and I won't elaborate on that, one of the weaknesses, the great weaknesses of System 1, is in statistical processing. System 1 tells stories about individual cases. It is actually very weak in drawing inferences from information about ensembles of cases. It just doesn't do this. It tells stories. And we are much better at inferring the general from the particular than at inferring the particular from the general. System 1 also has its conditions for believing that something is true, and that gets us to the topic of knowledge. Anything that is repeated many times will appear true, or more likely to appear true than something that is not repeated as frequently. Anything that is processed easily will appear true, or we are biased to believe that it is true. So if you change the font in a statement, the statement is more likely to be judged true if the font is clear than if the font is barely legible. If it rhymes, it's more likely to be true. So people believe that woes unite foes is judged like a better statement, more likely to be true than woes unite enemies. The first one rhymes, the second one doesn't. And rhyming makes the processing easier, makes the processing more fluent, and fluency the powerful cue to validity. So, what we have is a storytelling system, and the coherence of the stories determines how much faith we have in them. And the coherence is associative coherence, and it is emotional coherence. And so the conclusion, I think, is that System 1, in the story that I have described, is mostly in charge. I mean, there are times when it's not. So for scientists, in their role as scientists, they function mostly, with System 2, except that their expertise delivers things through their associative mechanism. But if we want to communicate with people who are not experts and who are not scientists, if we want to be effective in communication, we should speak to their System 1. And that is a different way of speaking. It almost necessarily involves stories. It involves concrete events. You have to assume that System 1 is largely indifferent to the quality and amount of evidence. It is bound more by the coherence of the story than by the evidence behind it. And then I would add something that I think is crucial. Because of emotional coherence, the source of the message is extremely important. The message the source has to be liked, and the source has to be trusted. And if the scientific establishment is not liked and is not trusted, then the amount of evidence really is going to have very little purchase on what actually happens to people. Messages from distrusted sources will be ignored. And and the amount of evidence will not matter. Now, another unfortunate characteristic of System 1 is that it's highly concrete, and so messages about threats that are abstract and distant will tend to be neglected. So global warming, it leads to a really pessimistic view about global warming. It seems unlikely that you can mobilize people in a democracy about a threat that is so distant and so abstract and so remote. It can be, terrifying, but it's not real for people. It would take, trusted conservative church leaders being mobilized for that kind of message to penetrate or to have any purchase, I believe. It's just not going to happen by itself. So, this is the story I had to tell you. And I can briefly summarize. I think there are those two ways of believing and knowing, and there are two ways of achieving coherence, logical coherence and associative or emotional coherence. And we tend to believe that we are our system too, because that's what we are conscious of, but in fact, most of what we're doing is dictated, and usually very appropriately and very correctly, by an associative system over which we have very limited control. And that, I think, has quite profound implications for the way we ought to talk to people. Thank you.